On this episode of Black Girl Gone, I tell the story of Anitra Gunn, who was just 23 years old when she disappeared on February 14th, 2020, in Fort Valley, Georgia. At first, her family thought maybe she was busy, but as the hours turned into days, fear began to replace hope. A massive search was launched across the area, but 4 days later, that search came to a devastating end when Anitra's body was found. What followed was a case that exposed the danger that she had been living with and the heartbreak of a family forced to face the unimaginable. This is Anitra's story. Valentine's Day is a day meant for love, a day where couples, families, and friends find small ways to remind each other that they're cherished. But for one family in Georgia, Valentine's Day will never be remembered for roses or heart-shaped candy. Instead, it became the day that they began living a nightmare. Anitra Gunn was young, beautiful, and full of life. She was in her final year of college, chasing her dreams, surrounded by people who adored her. She had already endured the kind of loss that most her age couldn't imagine, but she kept pushing forward, determined to build a future. And then, suddenly, she was gone. Calls went unanswered. Messages stopped. And in the silence that followed, the people who loved her most felt the ground beneath them shift forever. Anitra Lachey Gunn was born on November 6, 1997, in Camp Hill, Alabama. She was the daughter of Christopher Gunn and Melissa Shearhouse, and she had two siblings, one brother and one sister. But in 2014, tragedy struck when her mother was killed in a car accident. Anitra was just a teenager, and it was a devastating loss. But those who knew her said that she carried that grief with a quiet strength. Her father would later say that she became the center of his world, his pride and joy. Anitra spent most of her childhood in Atlanta, where she attended Westlake High School. Friends from that time remember her as a bright, dependable person who was always smiling. After graduating in 2016, she enrolled at Fort Valley State University, a historically Black college in Fort Valley, Georgia, and she majored in visual and performing arts, throwing herself into her classes and her creative work. She sang in the school's concert and gospel choirs, where her classmates described her voice as soulful. Outside of campus, she worked at a local restaurant, made time for her friends, and stayed close to her family. Both friends and faculty said that she had a way of making people feel special. One friend told reporters that she, quote, was always there for everyone else, while her father spoke of a young woman who had overcome so much and was finally stepping into her future. In early 2020, Anitra was just months away from graduating. She had her eyes on what was next, new opportunities, new possibilities. She was 23 years old, standing at the threshold of everything that she had worked for, and by all accounts, she was ready. But as much as her life was full of love and promise, there was also a complicated relationship that had started to weigh heavily on her. In the months before she disappeared, Anitra was in an on-again, off-again relationship with 23-year-old DeMarcus Little. The two met through a mutual friend, and by the fall of 2019, they were spending more and more time together. DeMarcus was a soldier in the U.S. Army, stationed at Fort Gordon in Augusta, and to his family, he was a disciplined young man who had grown up in church, someone they described as respectful and dependable. But for those closest to Anitra, the picture was different. Their relationship had quickly become complicated. Court records and text messages later revealed that by September of 2019, arguments were already surfacing. Anitra confided to friends that she often felt manipulated, that the relationship left her feeling drained instead of supported. And in one message that she sent that November, she told him plainly that she thought that they should stop speaking because every time they talked, she felt manipulated. DeMarcus, however, didn't let go so easily. In other messages, he accused her of playing games, of seeing other men, and even threatened to harm himself if she ended things. By early 2020, just weeks before Valentine's Day, their relationship was strained to the breaking point. And in early February, police were called after Anitra's tires were slashed and the windows of her apartment were smashed. Damage prosecutors would later say DeMarcus was responsible for. But to outsiders, he was the promising young soldier. But for Anitra and those who loved her, there were red flags everywhere. And in the days leading up to her disappearance, those red flags would only grow harder to ignore. On campus, Anitra tried to keep her smile, but those who knew her best could see the weight that she was carrying. Even as she sang in the choir or spent time with friends, there was moments when she seemed distant. They later said that she was trying to move forward, trying to focus on her future, but it was clear that the relationship was wearing on her. And yet, despite all of the red flags, no one could have predicted what was coming. Now, Valentine's Day 2020 would begin like any other Friday, but before the day was over, the silence around Anitra would spark a fear that her family and friends had never known before. Now, for most people, it was a day of celebration, flowers, cards, dinner plans. But for Anitra's family, it would become the day that their lives were forever changed. Now, the night before, February 13th, it's not exactly clear what happened during the day, but we do know that that evening, Anitra attended a party, and DeMarcus and a group of his friends also went. Now, although she had gone to the party with someone else, she ended up leaving with DeMarcus and his friend, who said he dropped them both off at Anitra's apartment. And then, in the early morning hours of February 14th, Anitra and DeMarcus went to get something to eat at a local Waffle House, arriving at the restaurant around 2 a.m. They stayed for about 30 minutes and then headed to DeMarcus's aunt's house. But the next morning, when her father tried to reach her, the phone calls went unanswered. The text messages never came back. And at first, it might have seemed like Anitra was just busy or tied up with school or friends. But as the hours passed, that silence began to feel heavier. And by the next day, February 14th, the worry had set in. Friends hadn't seen her. She hadn't shown up for work. And so an official missing persons report was filed. And the panic amongst those who knew her grew. But the same day, the mystery surrounding her disappearance also grew. Because hours after she was reported missing, her car was found with fresh damage on Bell Avenue, not far from where her apartment was. The bumper was missing, and the car was scraped and dented. It was a detail that immediately raised concerns because just days earlier, on February 5th, her tires had been slashed. And so, to those who loved her, it felt like the danger was closing in. Calls to her phone continued to go straight to voicemail. And for her father, Christopher, the dread grew stronger by the hour. He knew his daughter, and he knew that something was wrong. Before long, Anitra wasn't just a young woman missing calls. She was officially a missing person. Soon, officers in Fort Valley began canvassing the area, retracing Anitra's steps. They interviewed DeMarcus, the last known person to have seen her, who claimed to have no knowledge of where Anitra could be. And after learning that he had been at his aunt's house, they also spoke to her, and she claimed to have seen Anitra that morning. But what happened next was a mystery. They questioned friends and neighbors and followed up on every lead. Within hours, the case of a young woman missing had shifted into a full-scale search. The community rallied quickly. Volunteers began to look for signs of her. Flyers went up, vigils were planned, and her classmates at Fort Valley State prayed for her safe return while organizing their own searches. But as the hours stretched into days, hope was harder to hold on to. On Monday, February 17th, the search efforts grew into something much larger. A special task force was created, bringing together the Fort Valley Department of Public Safety, the Peach County Sheriff's Office, Fort Valley State University Police, the Bibb County District Attorney's Office, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Perry Office. Even the Georgia State Patrol joined in, sending aviation support to scour the woods and fields of the area from the air. That same day, Fort Valley State University released a statement about Anitra's disappearance, urging anyone with information to come forward. The campus community was shaken. This wasn't just a student missing classes. This was one of their own, a young woman known for her smile, her talent, and her determination. Her father also released a statement that day, publicly voicing what he had already known in his heart, that it was quote-unquote out of character not to hear from his daughter. He pleaded for her safe return, for anyone who knew anything to come forward. And for a father, the thought of losing his daughter was unimaginable. But by then, hope was already beginning to collide with fear. The task force worked tirelessly, searching, questioning, following every lead. And as the sun set on that Monday, the community braced for what the next day would bring. By Monday night, the search for Anitra had taken on a new urgency. Police, the GBI, even Georgia State Patrol aircraft were covering every possible lead. Everyone was on edge. Friends who were used to seeing her every day now checked their phones constantly, waiting for news that never came. Her father's words that it was out of character for her not to be in touch weighed heavily on everyone. He had always been close to his daughter, especially after losing her mother years earlier. He knew something was terribly wrong. The hours stretched on, each one filled with more questions. And as Tuesday morning approached, the sense of dread grew stronger. Everyone hoped Anitra would be found safe. But in their hearts, many already feared the truth. On February 14th, 2020, 23-year-old Anitra Gunn vanished. In the days that followed, an intense search swept across Fort Valley, Georgia. But as time passed, hope began to fade, giving way to the unimaginable. The search for Anitra had stretched through the weekend and into the start of the week, and each day brought more resources, more urgency, and more fear. And then, on Tuesday, February 18th, investigators finally found what they had been looking for. By that time, the search for Anitra had stretched across multiple counties. Authorities combed wooded areas in Peach and Crawford counties, and even extended their search into nearby Taylor County after an anonymous tipster reported seeing DeMarcus Little on a piece of property there in the days after Anitra vanished. The Georgia State Patrol joined in, sending troopers to assist, while Crime Stoppers announced a reward for information that might finally bring answers. But that afternoon, around 3:20 p.m., a Peach County deputy searching near the Peach-Crawford County line came across something hidden beneath the brush. It was the body of a young woman, her features matching Anitra's description. She had been covered with sticks and debris, discarded in the woods like her life didn't matter. But she mattered to so many, to her family, her friends, and in that moment, the hope of bringing her home alive was gone. Word of the discovery spread quickly, and her father, Christopher, was forced to face the unimaginable reality of losing his daughter, and the impact was immediate. At Fort Valley State, students gathered together, holding each other as they cried, unable to comprehend how someone so full of life could be gone. Professors and staff who had watched her grow over the 4 years struggled to find the words to comfort their students. For many on campus, it felt like losing family. With Anitra no longer missing, her father was now faced with the unbearable task of preparing to bury his daughter. He had begged for her safe return, held out hope that she would come home, and now he was left with only memories. His grief was also echoed by a community that had embraced Anitra as one of their own. For Fort Valley, for her family, and for her friends, the pain was sharp and deep. But alongside the grief came a demand for answers. Someone had taken Anitra's life, and now investigators were determined to prove who it was and how it happened. Following the discovery of Anitra's body, it was taken to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for an autopsy, and at first, investigators were cautious, waiting for the results that would explain how her life had ended. But soon, the findings confirmed what they had already suspected. Anitra's death was a homicide. The medical examiner determined that she had been killed by manual strangulation. It was a brutal, personal act, one that left no doubt that someone had intentionally ended her life. And that single detail shifted the case completely. This was not just about a missing woman or a young life cut short. It was about a murder. For her family, the confirmation was devastating. Hearing the word homicide attached to Anitra's name brought the nightmare into sharp focus. For investigators, however, it meant narrowing in on a suspect, and their eyes were already on the man who had been closest to her in those final hours, DeMarcus Little. Now, even before Anitra disappeared, there had already been troubling signs in her relationship with DeMarcus. Now, remember, on February 5th, just 9 days before she was last seen, police were called after someone slashed her tires and smashed the windows of her apartment, and investigators quickly tied that act of destruction to DeMarcus. It was an early indication that their relationship had turned volatile, and it gave police a clear reason to keep their eyes on him. And after Anitra's body was discovered, and the autopsy confirmed that she had been strangled, that earlier vandalism took on a much deeper meaning. To investigators, it wasn't just an angry outburst. It was part of a dangerous pattern. Now, they were looking at a young woman who had been trying to step away from a toxic relationship and a boyfriend whose behavior was growing more alarming. Detectives began retracing her final hours. Anitra was last seen on Valentine's Day with DeMarcus, and after that, her phone went silent. Friends told police that she had confided in them about feeling controlled and manipulated, and the text messages investigators recovered confirmed her words. Exchanges filled with jealousy, accusations, and threats. And on the evening of February 18th, just hours after Anitra's body was found, Fort Valley police questioned DeMarcus again. By 6:30 p.m. that night, he was arrested and booked into the Peach County Jail. Officially, it was for the February 5th attack on Anitra's car and apartment, but investigators were already convinced that DeMarcus was responsible for something much more serious, the murder of Anitra. They just needed to prove it. After DeMarcus was taken into custody on February 18th, investigators kept working behind the scenes. The autopsy results had confirmed that Anitra had been murdered, and with her death officially ruled a homicide, the focus of the case shifted sharply. Detectives pulled records from her phone and found that her last known location was near DeMarcus's aunt's house on Valentine's Day, and then after that, the trail went dark. With the cell phone data combined with the property damage just days before she disappeared, investigators began to see a pattern that they couldn't ignore. By the end of February, prosecutors were ready to move forward. A murder warrant was issued, and DeMarcus, already sitting in jail on the earlier charges, now faced the heavier accusation of killing Anitra. Investigators had also looked into his movements after she vanished, and an anonymous tip placed him on a property in Taylor County. It was a detail that only deepened their suspicion. Search teams covered that area, searching for anything that might connect him to where her body was eventually found. And piece by piece, the picture came into focus. The timeline, the digital evidence, the pattern of behavior, it all pointed back to DeMarcus. On February 25th, 2020, just a week after Anitra's body was found, a Peach County grand jury returned an indictment against DeMarcus Little. He was charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and concealing a death. The indictment laid out the state's case plainly, that on Valentine's Day, DeMarcus strangled Anitra and then tried to hide her body in the woods of Crawford County. For investigators, the indictment was the turning point. They had moved from suspicion to accusation, from gathering evidence to preparing for trial. But for Anitra's family, the indictment was both a relief and a fresh wound. It meant that the state was moving forward and that someone would be held accountable. But it also forced them to confront the truth that they had long feared, that Anitra's life had not only been taken intentionally, but that the person accused was the man that she had once trusted. The weight of that betrayal was something that no father should ever have to carry. What began as whispers of suspicion was now written in black and white. People who had followed every update now spoke less about hope and more about justice. There was sadness, yes, but also a determination to see the case through. The mood shifted from searching for answers to waiting for accountability. And for everyone who loved Anitra, the indictment was a reminder that a trial was coming, and with it, painful details. But there was also a sense that the first steps had been taken, and that Anitra's voice, stolen from her, would now be heard in the courtroom. In March of 2022, more than 2 years after Anitra's death, the case against DeMarcus Little finally went to trial in Peach County. The courtroom was packed. Family, friends, reporters, and community members, all waiting to hear how the state would lay out its case. For Anitra's father, Christopher, it meant that he was sitting just feet away from the man accused of murdering his daughter. Prosecutors opened with a simple but devastating theory that on Valentine's Day, after months of escalating conflict, DeMarcus strangled Anitra during an argument. They pointed to the timeline, how she was last seen at his aunt's home, where they believe the murder took place, and how her phone went silent after that, and how he became the last known person to see her alive. The jury heard about the February 5th incident when Anitra's tires were slashed and her apartment windows smashed. They heard about the text messages that revealed a relationship full of jealousy and control, and they saw the autopsy findings, with an act prosecutors said was deliberate and intimate. From the beginning, the prosecution painted a picture of a young woman trying to move forward with her life, and a boyfriend who refused to let go. And as the testimony unfolded, that picture only became clearer. When it was the defense's turn, DeMarcus took the stand. He admitted to damaging Anitra's car and apartment days before she disappeared, but denied killing her. He told the jury that he loved her, calling Anitra his soulmate, and insisted that he would never hurt her. His attorneys pointed to his military service and lack of criminal record, arguing that the state hadn't proven he was responsible for her death. But as the trial unfolded, the case against him only grew heavier. The day after DeMarcus was indicted, one of his friends, Javion Abram, was arrested and charged with concealing a death and making false statements. Prosecutors said that it showed that DeMarcus hadn't acted completely alone in the aftermath, and that someone had helped him try to hide what happened to Anitra. At trial, Abram testified against DeMarcus, telling the jury that he had confessed to him that he killed Anitra in a fit of rage after he told her he loved her, and she laughed. For the jury, the picture was coming into focus: the violence, the cover-up, and the devastating loss of a young woman whose life was stolen. After a week of testimony, the jury reached its decision. In March of 2022, DeMarcus Little was found guilty of felony murder and the death of Anitra Gunn. He was acquitted of malice murder, but convicted on the charges that carried the heaviest weight. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the harshest sentence available. And for Anitra's family, it was a measure of justice, though no sentence could ever bring her back. But in that courtroom, her father, Christopher, listened as that verdict was read. He had waited more than 2 years to hear those words. And it was the end of one painful chapter, but the beginning of another, a life without his daughter. For the community of Fort Valley, the verdict brought some relief, but also lingering grief. Anitra had been just months away from graduating college, with her whole life ahead of her. The jury's decision ensured accountability, but her absence left a void that no verdict could ever fill. Anitra Gunn was only 23 years old when her life was stolen. She had already endured so much loss when her mother died suddenly, but she had refused to let tragedy define her. She poured herself into her studies, her music, and the community that she found at Fort Valley State. She was a daughter who made her father proud, a friend who lifted up the people around her, and a young woman who deserved the chance to see all of her dreams through. In the end, the courtroom delivered accountability. DeMarcus Little will spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did. But justice in the legal sense can never undo the harm, cannot return the phone calls that went unanswered on Valentine's Day, or give her father back the daughter that he cherished. What it can do is remind us that Anitra mattered, her life mattered, and her story should never be reduced to a headline or a verdict. When we speak her name, we honor not just the tragedy of her death, but the beauty of her life, a life full of promise, love, and possibility. And as we remember Anitra, let us hold on to her light and let it be brighter than the darkness that tried to silence her. May Anitra Gunn rest in peace. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook,